are connected. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. My name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society. And I want to welcome you to today's session on climate adaptation strategies for wild and scenic rivers. This is our 5th session in the 2024 Wild and Scenic River Training Series, which is really just designed to help enhance your wild and scenic rivers expertise. And it's designed for professionals engaged in working on or with wild and scenic rivers. And it's not just about learning, it's about fostering a community of practice. So as I mentioned, this is the 5th session here. We've been doing these January through June, and you can find recordings of our previous sessions available on the RMS YouTube channel, where we have a Wild and Scenic River playlist. And I'm going to put that in the chat right now, so you have a link to it. But we have over 45 videos related to wild and scenic rivers, including topics on history of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, steps to determining user capacities, river values, Section 7, bank stabilization, a whole bunch more. So I encourage you to bookmark that and check it out if you're ever looking for more information on a certain topic. Again, welcome to those who are just joining. My name is Angie Furman, and today we are looking at the intersection of climate change and wild and scenic rivers. So we're going to be looking at some different challenges and impacts, some opportunities, some adaptation strategies that are being done, and build a foundation for protecting and enhancing river values for future generations. Just a few pointers or notes as we're getting started. This is being recorded, and I will post this on the YouTube channel, usually within the next 24 hours. I'll also email it out to everyone, just in case you can't stay for the whole session. You have access to it directly via email. We do have closed captioning available and a live transcript. And I also want to apologize. I know my voice is a little raspy, so thank you for bearing with me today. But first, I'd like to invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. You can click on that chat button to open up the chat box if you don't already have it up. And feel free to put your name and where you're at or what rivers you work with. And while you're doing that, I am going to have a couple of today's presenters introduce themselves. So first, I'd like to invite Mary Greenwood to introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Greenwood. I am the Comprehensive River Management Plan Project Manager for the U.S. Forest Service's Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers Office in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Mary. And now, Lela Blizzard.
Good afternoon. My name is Lela Blizzard. I work at Niobrara National Scenic River, and I am the Interpretation, Education, and Volunteer Program Manager.
Awesome. Thank you, Lela. And we may have Dave Cernicek, also from the Forest Service, joining us to share just a little bit about a quick example. But if he doesn't hop on, I've got some information that we can share about that as well. And I see we have all sorts of great experience in the room. So I am going to encourage everyone to really, participate in some discussion in this session. It's not just passive learning. We're hoping to have some good discussions and really foster that community of practice. So you can do this by communicating in the chat box, as you're already doing. We'll also have opportunities for you to raise your hand, come off mute. We don't have that big of a group today, so we'll have plenty of opportunity for that as well. So just a quick overview, very general overview of what we're going to be doing today. First, we're just going to be talking about some of the climate impacts on wild and scenic rivers. Then we'll be going through some common terms around climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and vulnerability. We'll be then looking at some strategies being done on a few different wild and scenic rivers, have an opportunity for others to share. We're going to review some data sets and useful tools when thinking about climate change and wild and scenic rivers, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So to kick us off, I am curious what climate change impacts you all here participating today have noticed on the wild and scenic rivers you work with. And again, you can put those in the chat. You're also welcome to come off mute and to share any of those, but really just like feel free to type them in. You don't even need full sentences. And I know it takes a minute to type, so all right. Earlier, more variable runoff. Thanks, Lisa, for that contribution. Jordan said low flow hydrology. Yes. Monica, flooding. These are impacts of fire on the water quality. We got coastal flooding and sea level rise, more flashy flooding, accelerated erosion from unusual number and severity of high water events, more intense climatic events, warmer water, water temperature increases and runoff changes, flooding, erosion, increased fog, invasive species expansion, impacting riparian forests such as vines, increased groundwater flows, possibly migrating pollutants into the river, rain versus snow-driven flooding, access infrastructure wrecked. Awesome. So you all know a lot about the different impacts to our wild and scenic rivers by climate change. And I want you to, keep in mind who's saying what and what everyone's experienced as we're drawing on each other, because as we know, we're kind of really just starting to learn more and more about climate change. And so just a quick review, some of the climate change impacts on fresh water. This is a graphic that's from the Natural Resources of Canada. And I know it's a little blurry, but up in that upper left-hand corner where, the top of the watershed, you got snowpack, where there's a possible reduction of snowpack, which could change water supply and flow regimes on rivers. I know a few of you mentioned that. Or we've got glacier melt with reduced water supply from shrinking glaciers. Forest fires. I'd be surprised if any of us here had not been impacted by forest fires, whether it's directly or it's from wildfire smoke. I know I was just hearing on the news earlier today about some evacuations in Canada and some air quality alerts from the smoke coming down from Canada. And that also can impact recreation on our rivers, right? Which is often an ORV, or an outstandingly remarkable value. We've got extreme weather with a possible increase in tornadoes, hailstorms, heat waves, droughts, dust storms, floods, blizzards, as well as the frequency and severity of these storms, as some people mentioned here in the chat. We've also got, flooding. We've seen some of the impacts of how that can affect stormwater runoff, threaten river habitat or water supplies. We've got a thing there for agriculture. And there it says the increased demand for irrigation and a change in crop types due to longer growing season, but also thinking about agricultural runoff into our rivers from storms. And then there's river flow, where lower river flow can reduce water supply, affect water quality, as well as recreation. It can also threaten our aquatic habitats, such as, like during seasonal events where certain species have important cues from these different seasonal flows, and if these cues aren't present, for example, certain fish will have more issues spawning, affecting our habitat. We've got warming water, and how it's stressing cold water species such as trout, but also nutrient runoff can lead to harmful algal blooms, or HABs, as I've seen it referred to. And then also thinking about reduced dissolved oxygen levels, which can also kill fish. We've got groundwater, and wells going dry, or how it can affect some seeps or springs. Or, for example, the river Styx at Oregon Caves National Monument, which is a wild and scenic river, relies on some of that groundwater recharge to protect its ORVs, its ecological ORV. And then infrastructure, as I also saw mentioned in the chat, and how things can degrade over time and struggle to keep up with more frequent and intense storms. So you all mentioned a lot of these things. And so we have a pretty good understanding, I think, of some of the different impacts to climate, or on our impacts on our rivers by climate change. And then also, as we're going into this discussion, just thinking about how not all areas are affected equally. So this is a map from NOAA that shows precipitation from how last year compared to all the data collected from 1895 through 2023. In that dark brown on that far bottom left here, you can see the record driest. And so record dry heat in New Mexico and in Louisiana, but also much below average in areas of the Northwest, Southwest, the South, and the Midwest. And then other areas had above average rainfall, like in California, parts of Wyoming and Colorado, as well as New England. So this is just trying to illustrate that not all areas are being affected equally by these different climate impacts. And then also, to complicate things as we're thinking about our wild and scenic rivers, is nearly every river has different river values and baseline conditions. So no two scenarios are necessarily going to be the same. So as we're working together and sharing examples and thinking about different strategies, I think it's awesome. Like, we should share and share and share, and not recreate the wheel, but also realize, not every scenario is going to be the same. All right, now that we got some of this out of the way, we are going to review some common terms when talking about climate change. And to do so, I'm going to pass it over to Mary.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. We are going to kick it off, and you can go to the next slide, with really talking about what is climate adaptation. So climate change adaptation really is the adjustment of our natural or human systems to a new or changing environment that takes advantage of beneficial opportunities and attempts to moderate negative effects. Adaptation is an intentional process that really begins with conducting or consulting science-based climate change vulnerabilities, risk, and impact assessments. Adaptation can take many forms, but generally it really requires collaboration across many different disciplines and all levels of government to achieve a mix of policy change that pertains to everything from land management to investments in infrastructure and public health safeguards. Effective climate change adaptation really requires participation from both resource managers as well as scientists. Adaptation also requires the flexibility to respond to changing threats, impacts, and priorities. Adaptive management can really help resource managers like ourselves make climate-informed decisions more quickly to keep pace with the new challenges and opportunities. Really, the big essential thing with climate adaptation is we also need to make sure that both mitigation and adaptation are essential to this process. So we're looking at changing our processes as well as modifying what works and what doesn't as the environment changes around us. Next slide. Some additional key terms that you hear about when you talk about climate adaptation is climate exposure. And this is the degree to which a system is exposed to climatic changes, including the direct effects, indirect effects, and interactions between these, as well as non-climate stressors, such as the development and spread of invasive species. This is really the what when you start thinking about it, the what is happening. In contrast, the climate variability is the degree to which the physical, biological, and socioeconomic systems are susceptible to and unable to cope with these adverse impacts of climate change. So this is the likelihood, how common is it this going to occur? And it really is a function of the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity of these systems. And the systems could be our natural environment, or our infrastructure and our communities as well. A last term I wanted to touch on was environmental justice. And this is really the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So this is keeping a broad outlook as we start thinking about the policies we're going to implement, where we're going to implement them, and how we implement them to make sure that we are providing access and doing the work that needs to be done in the communities that need that done. Next slide. So there's a couple management options that can be helpful to think about that I wanted to define as we move forward when we're thinking about climate change adaptation, and that's resistance, resilience, and transition. So resistance actions really are those immediate mitigation kind of actions. These defend a system against disturbances or other anticipated changes to keep the system relatively unchanged. Our resilience actions enhance our ability of the system to return to a prior condition after disturbance. Although some degree of change may occur, the intent is for the system to return to a state similar to what it was before the disturbance. The last one is transition, and these transition actions intentionally accommodate or promote change to better align with our future climate conditions. By encouraging an intentional transition, it might be easier to maintain important functions and values over time, even as the character of the system changes. Next slide. So when we think about climate change and adaptation and the role and interaction with wild and scenic rivers, there is one value that kind of begins to rise to the surface. And that's the fact that wild and scenic rivers really can represent an area of what we call climate refugia. Climate change refugia areas are areas that remain relatively buffered from contemporary climate change over time and enable persistence of valued physical, ecological, and sociocultural resources. The key attribute of refugia is that their relative persistence over time, despite changes in the climate and the surrounding landscape. That's not to say that every wild and scenic river necessarily represents a climate refugia. However, simply with the nature of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and what we go to protect, there usually is quite a bit of correlation and crossover there. There's a few ways that climate adaptation has been considered in wild and scenic river management planning. One path forward could be identifying climate refugia specifically as an ORV, either as a standalone ORV or by including climate refugia elements in other ORVs such as water quality, ecology, fisheries, or wildlife, with specific design features for management actions, monitoring and measures for meeting and protecting the climate refugia nature of the river. Another option really is to include general management strategies for addressing climate change in our comprehensive river management plan documents. These strategies don't necessarily provide definitive solutions or directions, but they do provide some science-based and scholarship-based management principles to consider when we implement the broader management direction of our comprehensive river management plans. And that is where we're going to kind of go as we start discussing these examples.
Thanks, Mary. And I do want to just put in a plug for a river management roundtable session we had done last year on Climate Refugia is an ORV, and so I'm gonna put a link in the chat to a recording of that if people are interested in rewatching that session. So, yeah, let's see. All right. So our first example that we're going to explore, I'm going to pass it over to Lela.
All right. Well, so Niobrara National Scenic River is in Nebraska, for those who do not know where we are located. And we are kind of, I mean, all rivers have their own different issues and everything like that, but we have 6 ecosystems along the 76 miles of designated scenic river. We have the northern boreal forest, western coniferous forest, an eastern deciduous forest, a tall grass prairie, mixed grass prairie, and the sandhills prairie. So all of these are coming together in the 76 miles that we talk about, that we manage. It also, that's including all the animals and different species that are involved in that. So we do get some interesting hybrids occasionally. The other challenge we face is the park itself doesn't actually own much land along the river. So doing some of the actions and how we can manage the river itself and help protect our ORVs is pretty important. I mean, we have paleontology, recreation. Those are just 2 of our 6 ORVs that we help to do. And so we have a lot of challenges around climate change. So we're actually in the process of making a comprehensive river management plan where we're looking at the futures that the river could face so we can potentially figure out what we want to do, and then but we don't know because nobody knows what exactly is going to happen. So these are just ideas and plans that we can put into place. And one of the first things we have to do is we have to get information. Next slide, please. And one of the ways we are getting information about our river is through we're monitoring water quality and quantity. These, as you can see, we're just checking to see what the temperature is. Now, we typically go out from April through October, November-ish is when our resource management actually goes out and they do the water quality tests. What they're doing is they're just checking to see what is going on out there on the river, because our river is actually mostly groundwater fed. There is some from the snowpacks and rains and things like that. Like, it'll go up briefly during a heavy rainstorm or just after. But for the most part, our water levels are coming from the groundwater, and that can change depending on the year and how much rain we get, because if it's a dry year, the agriculture industry actually pulls more water from the river. So we're trying to figure out all of these things that are going to impact the ORVs on our river. So that's one of the things we do, is we try to monitor the water quality and quantity. They go out, they do 3 days of testing, because again, we have 76 miles of river. They have to get all of these samples back so they can check them within just a few hours. So it's a time-consuming process that our resource management team undertakes. They also do a few other things as well to help monitor climate change as well. Next slide. Some of that is they do wildlife surveys. As I mentioned, we have 6 different ecosystems. What they're doing is they're constantly going out every month, even 12 months a year, sometimes even more, and they're doing wildlife surveys. They're checking to see what animals they see along the river, and then they actually go out and look for the endangered species as well. And it's determined that on years where there's a lot of flux in our river levels, that there is a chance that that does mean the least tern and piping plovers are having some issues, because the water level is not changing 1 foot or maybe around that. It can go up to 5, it can vary 5 feet, and that can cause some issues. They're just trying to figure out what's going on. They don't know. It's a work in progress. But one of the things we do in interpretation, because around here at Niobrara, climate change is a dirty word. people shut down, they don't like that word, climate change. So one of the things I do is actually we go out and we provide public education. How we're doing that is sometimes we don't use the word climate change. We talk about extreme weather events because that's something that most people around here understand. We'll talk about the bomb cyclone that wiped out a dam outside of our scenic river and how that is adjusting the water levels still today down in that area because, again, it's groundwater fed. And so there's lots of different ways that we can talk about it and people can relate to it. We are also a Earth to Sky, which is a NASA partnership where we provide educator and informal and formal educator workshops to talk about the idea of climate change. Our first workshop is actually going to be in June of 2025. We're going to be bringing in NASA scientists, some folks from the National Weather Service, Park Service, a bunch of different agencies to kind of come together and talk about how we are dealing with this idea of climate change and how we can start educating the public about it. We actually worked with the National Park Service's climate team this past year. They have a wonderful person working with them. Her name is Claire. She actually redid our climate change section on our park website, and she's done it for a couple different parks now as well to just provide this more information on what the National Park Service in general is doing, but also a little bit about what we specifically are doing. The other thing we do is we have to work closely with various partners across the Niobrara Valley in order to get information to go out and do those water quality tests. We have to work with folks to maybe dig groundwater monitoring wells or see how we can get grants or help people learn about the fire impacts from the cedars along the river and what they can do about them. We can't do a lot for them, but we can help get information out about different things. We have a council that we work with to help with our education, our conservation easements. We work frequently with the National Weather Service out of North Platte, Nebraska as well. We have our own webpage for them, and they can do this for a lot of different sites. And it'll bring up the weather along your river so that people, for the recreation purposes, can see what the weather might be at a certain set point on your river during a timeline. Because we all know that our rivers along the entire, you can be, 3 miles away, it can be really nice and, you have a storm. So that's one of the things that they do for us. And we work with them to assist with their education programming as well. You actually can see Sean Jacobs there from the National Weather Service talking to a school group during our Nature Fest event. Yes, right there. We actually bring in students from all over, and we work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We hold it at their bison corrals every September to be able to do an event. And this year's topic and theme is actually going to be climate change. So that's actually one of the things all of our presenters are going to talk about. They're going to talk about some of our partners do adaptations. So those are ways we start talking about climate change so that people in the area can understand. Because we can have all this data, we can do a comprehensive river management plan, but we also have to want the people who come to see us to want to understand the effects that climate change is having on the river and some very special plants and animals that we have. We have an aspen tree that's only found here. It's called the Smith Falls aspen. It's a hybridized aspen from the last ice age. So, and it's the boreal forest. It requires very cool conditions. And they're trying to figure out what's going to happen to this aspen as things continue to get warmer in those lock canyons. So we have lots of monitoring still to do. And that's really what we are doing here. A lot of it's monitoring because we have to plan for the future, but we have to get that data set first.
Thanks, Lela. I'm excited to
right.
come. I want to come out and visit the Niobrara. I've seen a lot of beautiful photos. So,
Well, I was gonna say, Bobby would love to have you this summer.
yes. All right. If Dave Cernicek, I'm gonna kind of see if you can speak a little bit about An example you had shared with me about green algae bloom on the Snake River.
Sure, I can. Years ago, around maybe 2016, 2017, just noticed putting a boat in the water one day, that, there's something kind of green and glowing in the middle of the river. It's like, what's that? Really bright. Strangely, at the same time, had river guides down in the canyon that were claiming that they were getting a weird foot rot type of thing on their feet. And so it's kind of weird to think about. Oh, got a slide on it. There's the green stripe, but the green stripe kept getting longer and longer. And it's like about 10 in the morning was like the best sun for the green stripe, that it just start to glow. And it's like, it's obviously an algae, but what's going on? And it's like, I need someone smarter than me. Called in public health, called in state DEQ, and we kind of set out to figure things out. Public health started talking to the guides. DEQ came in, went out on the river for a few days, and did water quality samples on drainages, around the usual suspects like golf courses and sewer plants and stuff like that. But they had high nitrates on a few things, but nothing to really explain this. And did some studies, checked all the water quality stuff, and the best we could come up with is climate change. It was an algae that was native to the Snake River, but doesn't grow in those proportions, hasn't ever grown in those proportions. It has to do with our water levels being much lower later in the summer, and thus making the water hotter in the summer, a lot warmer in the summer. That makes great growing conditions for this algae that's usually on the side of the river, but it's growing on the bottom of in the middle of the current. The current's going slower. So kind of a weird thing to deal with. And, it's like, I live in a state that doesn't really like to talk about climate change. They took it out of the schools curriculum for quite a while. But yeah, all we could figure out is it's a changing climate, and watch it happen every few years where things are low. We get the green stripe, and it goes on for miles. So, that's one of those obvious things you can see from far away, and it's very visual. And those are the nice ones for climate. It's the things that we can't see are the tough ones for climate, and the ones that we have to stay on top of.
Yeah, Dave, maybe you can speak to, I know it's not necessarily designated wild and scenic, but just like the idea of thinking into the future and
Absolutely. Things that we should be doing as river people, obviously, we should be living our lives to prevent climate change or slow down. We can't prevent it or stop it unless everybody wants to play. But one of the positive things we can do is really think out what our projects are and think them out into 30 years of climate, 30 years from now, dealing with climate change. Obviously, something that you should be doing and addressing in your CRMP if you haven't already, or you have the opportunity or doing one presently. But when it comes to things like installing culverts, when one breaks down, falls apart, that type of thing, we tend to have no money. We tend to go cheap, probably not put in a big enough one. But that culvert we need to put in should be adapted in size to the massive water rushes that we're going to be getting in our shoulder seasons, that type of stuff. Not for the water that's coming through it right now, but the bigger water that's going to be coming in the future. So, the smaller, cheaper culvert might end up being a lot more expensive than putting in a bigger culvert that's going to be more adaptable to things as, bigger runoffs coming all at the same time. So yeah, this is there used to be a marina on Lake Powell, Hike Marina, and used to be a place you'd get out from cataract trips after rowing many hand blistering miles on cataract to get your raft out of the water on Lake Powell. And it was a nice multi-million-dollar marina. But now it's, you can see it's quarter to a half mile away from the river as Lake Powell has dropped on us. Back to the point, plan towards the future and the things that you're spending money on. Really think it through so that as things adapt, as conditions change on the ground, that your project is still going to be successful 30 years from now and won't be a embarrassing thing that you never want to drive by and show your grandkids, because you have a boat ramp that's half a mile away from the river and it's really stupid looking and it's associated with you. But yeah, that's one of the things that I really encourage people is think about what you're doing and think about it into the future, not just the here and now, and not just get it done the easiest, simple, cheapest way, which is typically what a lot of us do, but do it right and do it for the future. And, don't embarrass yourself. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. And, one thing to think about is that we don't have to necessarily create the wheel, that there's a lot of tools and resources available to us. There's lots of GIS data or other types of data that can help us model or come up with different adaptation strategies. So I am going to pass it back to Mary to maybe walk us through some of these.
Right. And so there are a lot of resources out there. We're going to kind of hit a little bit on training as well as some data sources here. So the first of which is this adaptation workbook. This was created by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And really it is a wealth of resources. If you just go to the adaptationworkbook.org, you're going to find not only strategies to help you walk through different processes and projects, you're going to find training modules. There is just a lot of information that really focuses on how we're implementing climate adaptation across agencies. Obviously, one of the pictures you can see here, or the picture included here, is the Forest Service adaptation resources. They've got just a wealth of tools to go through there. So I strongly encourage, if you're interested, you could spend hours going down all the different documents that they have included here. There are greater USDA documents. There are those focused Forest Service documents. But even though they're written by these specific agencies, their applicability goes well outside Forest Service boundaries. So I strongly recommend everyone to check this resource out. Let's go next slide.
And this is just some more. Yeah.
Yes. So this is more of the different strategies and approaches, like I said, and this isn't even all of them. So really they're also working on additional topics. They might have finished some of them already, but we're talking about wildlife, fire adapted ecosystems, how we work with coastal conditions, the freshwater sea level rise. There's really, like you said, there's just about anything you could really be interested in, you're going to be able to find in this adaptation workbook. We're not going to go over each one specifically, but like I said, I strongly encourage you to find that. And Angie's going to be sharing this presentation, so you don't have to scramble for these links by any means. Although it looks like you did put it in the chat already. So it's really they've got PowerPoints as well. Like I said, you could spend hours, you could spend a week and not finish everything in here, even remotely close. So.
And then another one that I just wanted to mention is that National Park Service also has some climate training. They do have some self-study modules just around interpreting climate change, and could be really useful, not only for like your own education and understanding, but as well as thinking about delivering interpretation to visitors to your river. And then they just have another website just around some of the climate change initiatives that they're doing within the Greater Park Service. And I'll also put those in the chat there.
So these are some more resources. The ones on this page are pretty straightforward. I'm not going to do too much of a background on them, but they're really practitioner guides, implementation guides. So it's just really incredibly helpful. And as you can see, we're trying to provide you some resources, not just from one singular agency. NOAA has some amazing kits as well. And a lot of these resources are not only going to have these practitioners guides, they're going to also have training in addition that you can access from there. You'll see the adaptation workbook is listed again. And then there's also this Climate Adaptation Science Center professional development site. Again, if you're looking to do a little bit more of a deeper dive to educate yourself on climate adaptation and how to incorporate it in your work, this is another great site to access. And then this is the link specifically to that Forest Service adaptation resources, the climate change tools and approaches for land managers. Again, this link is going to be the PDF that you saw the picture of, and it has some great direction for land managers moving forward. Now, this page we have, this is a little bit more in the data set world. So I did want to provide you some links. You can find them on most of those web pages that we provided in the previous resources You can find them. They can be a little trickier to dig down into just because there is so much information available. So these are just a handful of the ones that I personally have used when considering whether it's climate refugia, when developing just general climate adaptation strategies for rivers or larger projects. And so the first of which is the National Water and Climate Center. This link specifically is for the Snow and Water Interactive Map Tool, which is designed to provide really anyone with up to the minute snow survey data and water supply forecasting. It gives you not only real time, but it goes historical as well. And so this is a really great tool if you're wanting to look at something to track those snow survey data, snowfall levels, and your water data nationally. The Forest Service Climate Risk Viewer, this really draws from 30 different data sets to illustrate the overlap of multiple values with climate exposure and vulnerability. It also can include current management direction for national forest system lands. And so it really allows resource managers to kind of pull all this information in a single spot to assess the need for climate adaptation to maintain valued resources. Again, this one's very much Forest Service specific, but it's a great tool just to look at if you're wanting to see maybe even some different ways that you can incorporate and overlay data yourself. The next site is the Rocky Mountain Research Station Climate Shield site. So this hosts geospatial data and related information that describes the specific locations of cold water refuge streams for native cutthroat trout and bull trout across the American West. This one's a little bit more regional. It does not apply. They are working on expanding this this venue of research nationally, but right now this focus is just for the Western United States. There is an interactive map, but there are also the links to download shapefiles and data in that site as well. The Stream Flow and Climate Change in Changing Climate, which is another Rocky Mountain Research Station site, has just recently completed a new analysis of projected stream flow metrics across the contiguous United States over the coming century. So this is really futuring. It does provide, it starts with the historical, which they categorize as 1977 to 2006. Then they do mid-century and then end century. End century is ending in 2099. So, and it also focuses on some absolute and percent change over time. So it's a really interesting site to look at for projecting outward. The last one I wanted to include here, we haven't touched a ton on the environmental justice, but this is a really great tool when you are looking at kind of large scale planning. And this is the EJ screen, and this is the EPA's environmental justice mapping and screening tool. And so it really provides a nationally consistent data set and approach for combining environmental and demographic socioeconomic indicators to really do those overlays of of which communities are most likely to be affected by climate change, as well as, again, overlaying that with socioeconomic demographics. So you can see what communities might be most effective and how we can make sure that we are, once again, considering our solutions for the greater good across the whole, regardless of our socioeconomic and demographic information. So that one's just a really, really great tool to look at. There is so much information that you can play with, whether it's sea level rise, snowpack change. You're looking at all your census information gathered into one place as well. So it is a really neat tool to play around with in addition.
Thanks, Mary. And I'm curious if anyone here has had any experience using any of these resources or tools and would be willing to share how they might have used them or any experiences with them. You're welcome to put it in the chat, or you can just come off mute and share with us. I know we've got a lot of experience in the room, so.
Angie, I can offer just some comments from the nonprofit side. So I'm Lisa Ronald. I work with American Rivers in Western Montana. And in our interactions with the Lolo National Forest, which is undergoing a forest plan revision right now, we've used the climate shield data to inform our recommendations to the Forest Service during the eligibility assessment. That's part of the planning process. And that's been a really effective way for us to sort of communicate the values of some of the rivers.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Lisa. Anyone else have anything they'd like to share? Well, while you're maybe thinking, really now we've just got some time for questions. And you know, like I just mentioned, we have a lot of experience and knowledge in this room. And so really just having sort of that discussion and seeing different people's thoughts. So I don't know if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask or raise.
I have a question. Mary, maybe you or others have used that EJ tool. I'd love to know how you have used it, or if you haven't, how you understand other people are using it.
Sure. And I have, I've looked at it briefly. I haven't incorporated it wholeheartedly into projects before. How we have used it larger in the past is kind of has not been river specific per se, but in larger recreation management plans. And so what we've really done is we've expanded our scope. Again, this was national forest based. We've expanded our scope, whether we're looking at, typically when we're looking at recreation management plans that potentially include new and developed sites, or adding, say, recreational fees, and widening that aperture to see the communities that we might be affecting, how, say, a recreation fee, for example, might affect a community that is using it. Are we implementing a recreation fee in an area that is heavily used by communities that have a lower income, where that might put an undue burden on them trying to access public lands? We've also looked at another way that I know it's been used in the past is when we're looking at whether it's permitting city buses or shuttle services to access national forest land. Again, looking at what we might feel are underrepresented communities or underserved communities that do not have the same access to transportation to get to our public lands. And so once again, kind of opening up that aperture to consider how might we think about how we're doing business differently to make sure that we're not only providing access to public lands, but really encouraging use from greater communities as a whole, and not just our, I guess, kind of the traditional recreating public that has been in the primary viewshed in the past. So those are a couple of ways that we've used that. It's really trying to widen, go out a little bit more to see the communities that we're dealing with, to see if there are communities that are underserved and underrepresented, and might be more negatively impacted than others by the results of our decisions.
So kind of follow-up question, thank you for that, because it's sort of a chicken and eggy kind of thing. If you identify, say, a new place or are revisiting some place that's been opened, and either acknowledging that there are more types of people than traditionally visit, or it's a new place, say, where there's an emerging population that would need new consideration. Have you heard of how that gets balanced? Like, say you're in Philly and you've got wealthy people, you've got way not wealthy people, and you have a new site, that's just an urban example, is more extreme or more complex. You charge different people different rates. I mean, you can't do that, right? So have you heard of, right? So you really can't, but how do you balance that? Because both types of people are walking through the gate.
Right. It can be challenging. But some of the ways that we do look at that is, and this is going to be, it's not going to specifically address all the complexity of what you propose, but, some of the things we look about as, when we turn back our clock, especially from the recreation planner on national forest brains, we have some very traditional expectations and designs around how we design our recreation sites. So let's say if we were putting something new out or improving it, we really had a very kind of narrow view of how we design and how we thought people liked to recreate on the forest. And so looking at those proximity measures, looking at the community that we're truly serving, and then there's a lot of social science on researching how different communities like to engage. And you can bolster that with even doing local community surveys. And so it's really thinking differently about how we're designing places. Are we doing larger group sites? So it's not just thinking, our traditional, very traditional, picnic or campground site that is, is open for up to 6 people. And so rethinking the communities we're serving. Do we need larger sites? Do we need community engagement points that are going to provide a shade shelter where folks can get out of a heated environment and come and engage in the forest in a manner that they feel more comfortable doing so. So that's kind of how we would do that. You definitely can't charge the fees, but one of the things we do and how we consider this is it is something we are integrating more and more in our environmental analysis when we propose projects, including fee increases. And so that's really doing the work to look at what that fee increase, what that might have, or adding a new fee, the impacts that might have on those communities that we are serving. And are we going to, by addition of a fee, is there a potential that we might turn this into de facto only a site for the wealthy because they can afford XYZ fee? And that's not only, we think about these factors not only in the actual monetary cost, but the time cost and how much time folks actually have to use reservation sites to, put in for lotteries, that kind of sort of thing. So that's when we come to especially recreation management, and I'm sorry, that's what I mostly speak to, is that's my background. That's what we really look at. And we're trying to really do that harder look as to the management choices we're making and how that is going to reflect on who we're actively welcoming onto the forest.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. We're so transactional. That's how we are. That's how our systems are. Right. And all the systems haven't asked all the people in our audience, because the systems were set up before we cared about them or were considering them, right? Yeah, no, thank you though. That's helpful. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Mary, that's a little different. So, you said that, forests can adopt a climate refuge ORV, or they can integrate climate refuge into existing ORVs. I'm wondering if you can supply a couple of examples of where that's been done well in both of those different ways, on a wild and scenic river, whether that's eligible, suitable, designated, whatever. I wonder if you have some examples there.
We don't really have a whole lot of hard and fast examples yet. You all, what the work that's going on in the Lolo is some of that's been included. So I can single out David Cernicek a little bit if he wants to get back on as well. The snake is what we've seen more traditionally. It hasn't been called out as climate refugia, but what we have seen is when in the fisheries ORV or wildlife ORV, where we have identified specific, if we're talking about water temperature, if we're talking about season of use or something to that effect, where it's really incorporated those kind of components of what we know now and talk about now more as climate refugia. There haven't been, the climate refugia as an ORV is just starting to gain traction over the last few years. And so there haven't been a whole lot of new plans that have been finalized that have identified it. There's none to my knowledge that have been identified with climate refugia as a standalone external ORV. For the most part, it's being incorporated to make sure we're hitting those components and elements in the ORVs, that in other ORVs, as well as trying to make sure we're identifying that monitoring and mitigation efforts in the monitoring, but not calling it out one-on-one. That being said, there's lots of different, there's some revisions in the books going on right now, so we might see that as it moves forward. But David, you want to talk a little bit more about that too, now that I put you on the spot?
I think you've said most of it. For us, for Snake River headwaters, we broke things into a wildlife ecological ORV and fisheries. And that's where our climate stuff is integrated into those two ORVs. I haven't heard a huge amount of warmness to having a climate refugia ORV. And within like Interagency Wild and Scenic Coordinating Council, maybe Steve can speak to that. But no, ours are we've addressed it, but yeah, not in a specific ORV.
Okay, yeah, maybe just a quick follow-up question then. I appreciate that. I was not aware of any examples, so I wanted to ask the question to see if I was wrong, if there had been examples, that I wasn't aware of. I'm wondering if both of you might speak a little bit more to any challenges that you're encountering as you're sort of integrating and operationalizing climate refuge into existing ORVs. I ask that because I think one of the challenges that I'm seeing on the Lolo, which is undergoing this plan right now, is that they want to capture things like cold water and connectivity within the fish ORV, but there are places on the forest that provide connectivity that don't have like unique current fish populations, but are really important like connectors to climate refuge identified headwaters. And so there's this weird limitation that, if it doesn't currently have an existing fish population, it's not really being considered for its connectivity values, or it's not, or like cold water areas that are currently cold, but don't necessarily have like super outstanding, fish resources aren't being considered because they're not currently, like the fish aren't currently there, but they, like this is a sort of futuristic climate thing. So I'm wondering if you're encountering challenges like that, and if so, like, are you working around those, or are there or are these just new and unique challenges, or are there other challenges you're seeing with integration there?
The biggest challenge on everything wild and scenic is getting the monitoring done and figuring out what to monitor, who's going to monitor, and having the resources to monitor. We're trying very hard to, we have a lot of interest in our area for water quality stuff and having constant monitoring upstream, downstream, and being able to integrate things throughout the valley between the park, the forest, the county, that type of thing. Over the Tetons, there's an organization called the Henry's Fork that has an amazing setup that we're kind of striving to be like. Our partners, not us, we're not that wealthy, but yeah, you have to have the trend line to figure out what's going on, and that's what we are trying to set up. And that's critical how you set up your monitoring, because if you can't accomplish something you set up in your plan, then it's kind of worthless. If you can find, partners integral to getting things done and being successful with whether it's your river or climate or whatever, because if you're not watching, it's going to happen and you're not going to notice it necessarily. But I don't know if any of that's helpful to you. But
the monitoring piece. Yeah, I get what you're saying there, and yeah, I think that's super helpful, and that may be so where some of the limitations are either perceived or exist, is that maybe there's not the ability to monitor as well as you might want for certain things, where there's questions about how to do that. So yeah, I see your point there. I appreciate the dialogue.
I'll go ahead and put up the Henry's Fork Foundation dashboard on their water quality monitoring, which is super impressive, that anybody can look up at any time. Having things in place, even if they're a different agency, is great to me. If the state is watching something or counting something, or any other agency, I can take that data and not have to collect it myself. That is much better. But yeah, the devil is always in the details versus, the federal budget.
Anyone else have any comments on that?
Well, and I was gonna touch on, I think, Lisa, you kind of summed up what some of the issues, the problems are with that. It's really this rethinking climate refugia. It's looking at how we identify ORVs, and really, I think there's just still a process to work through that we're still trying to balance generally as how we are considering that, what level are we considering it. And this goes back to again, kind of that level of significance factor, and how we're considering as we're doing the survey, how are we identifying it as a unique and critical element. So there's still a lot to work through as we've kind of started thinking about this more, and it's started to gain traction in the last couple of years. There's still very much some bumps to work through, for sure. So I think you captured kind of what the current issues are with it. And, as of yet, there aren't a slew of solutions out there for dealing with it, other than trying to work through them together with our partners, the public, and the managing agencies to try and find a balance there.
We're also, trying to add more gauges to our streams within our designation, that can watch dissolved oxygen, that can watch temperature, those types of things, because, part of it is to make the state happy and more comfortable with adjudication that we're going forward with, but also for, climate, we can monitor now. It's much more powerful, and it's so much more easier than finding someone to go down to the river and do that monitoring, which is really hard when you're pressed for time and you're pressed for money. But, a lot is in the gauges, but they're super expensive. That takes partnerships, and, it's challenging. But yeah, new gauges on different streams is super helpful.
Well, I did see a question come in from Alan in the chat that's saying, Alan's curious about some strategies to protect temperature sensitive species, and in particular, or temperature sensitive species that are ORVs, like the cold water trout, and something more active than riparian buffer protection or buffer plantings. But curious if anyone out there has any ideas on some more active approaches Alan offered like chilling wastewater treatment plant discharge as MPDES permit conditions, and using Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to drive permit changes.
While we wait to see if anyone has any specific examples, I was chuckling to myself when I saw Alan's comment, because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who is not within any agency, but she is a wastewater engineer within the private sector. And she asked me this specific question, you know, and I think right now where the wall we run up against is our regulatory authority going outside the bounds of the the Wild and Scenic River buffer. But I think it's really interesting, and I think it's definitely, I've been trying to roll around in my head and brainstorm how we engage kind of those larger conversations with those folks we might not traditionally think of as management partners, especially if we're going a little upstream and of our typical Wild and Scenic River corridor. Because like I said, she was asking this exact same question and said, oh, can you set limits on what the chilling should be, you know, different levels in that aspect, well outside of my normal range of understanding. But it was definitely a really interesting thing to think about. And I'm not quite sure how we start initiating those larger conversations and try to work with the agencies that have regulatory authority over situations like that. But it was, yeah, again, no real good examples. But I think that definitely is an active approach. We just don't know how to go about it quite yet, unless anyone else has had some success with that.
I see Alan followed up with, we have discharges within the Wild and Scenic River corridor since it's a partnership, Wild and Scenic Rivers, so over in New Jersey. All right, I saw another question come in. Where am I here? Asking Dave, are you working with USGS gauge request? Have they just asked for specific needs? They have just asked for specific needs in my area, the Mid-Atlantic, making me think they may have received funds from someone. And is there opportunities, or you said it can be expensive, so.
I work with people who work with USGS on gauge requests. One thing we found is, you know, our local conservation district gets the biggest discount on asking and funding USGS gauges. The price is a lot less than if the Forest Service asks for it. And so we go through them on gauges. One thing to know about USGS is they very brilliantly put their overhead into gauges. So their employees are paid for and such. So they're not cheap. They, you know, usually start around $18,000 a year. And so even going through the conservation district. So kind of in a way, yes. If they have money for you, I'm surprised, but get all you can and use it smartly. Put your gauges in important places.
Dave, this is Risa. I asked because I've never seen a question from the USGS saying, would you like more gauges ever? It's always been, here are the ones that are closing. So it's just so unusual. And it was just a couple of weeks ago. So I've got to believe that they applied for one of these, you know, something.
Yeah, they're not a Go Help Voters organization at all. Although we do love them to death. I remember the days before Gauges Online where, you know, if you're going to Colorado, it's like, does your grandma live by the Arkansas River? Could you call her and see what the river's looking like? You know, you kind of went to a river blind, didn't know what river CFS rates or anything. But yeah, those aren't for us. Those are for irrigators. And
Guess
Hey,
what?
Risa, we've been working with USGS a bit in Moab, and that question you're asking is, yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the money. It's IRA money, and they're expanding the federal priority stream flow gauge network. These are the stream gauges that exist outside of the state of Utah. Dave, you hit it right on the money. We're about 16.7 per annum per gauge, with the discount we get as a state. When a gauge gets moved onto federal priority stream flow gauge network, USGS covers 100% of that. And so this isn't a bottomless pit of money. But for example, we only have one stream flow gauge on the Colorado River on something like 270 river miles between Cisco and the Arizona state line. That one, shockingly, is not a priority gauge. We're going to move that onto the list. So that's kind of that question that's been going around a lot of we were just talking about it in a Utah state level BLM interagency river planning meeting. But yeah, that's cool that IRA is going to help fund that. I think if you want your gauge funded, you got to get on the horn with your partners, your local emergency managers, and your conservation district, and partner up with your community and make the case. Yeah.
I'm hearing a theme of partnerships everywhere today, and I think that's important to bring up as we're working on, adapting to climate changes on our rivers. And Lela, I didn't know, I saw you posted in there. Niobrara is also working with USGS to add more gauges along the Niobrara.
That's about the extent of my knowledge, but if those folks who do have specific questions, Travis Connett, our resource manager, is more than happy to answer some of those questions. He's at Train Shaw training. That's why he's not doing this.
And then I've seen Matt have make a couple comments about just the designation of Wild and Scenic Rivers could be considered as a climate mitigation strategy, or about the importance of climate refugia and how arguments could be made about it being an ORV on almost every river. So, and thanks, Lela, for providing Travis's contact info there. Any other questions, comments, other resources that people have been using to address climate change on their rivers that they've been finding particularly useful that we haven't touched on today?
I have a climate refugia question for Wild and Scenic experts that I'm not, if that were sought and all the necessary steps were taken for it to be considered within the boundary and, exclusive to the area and all that kind of stuff, is it as simple as climate refugia being considered as an other? Because there's the main ORVs and then other, and the other includes a small basket full of things that you don't often see. Sometimes it's water, sometimes it's ecology, things like that. So could climate refugia become an other, as opposed to having us, redefine what basic ORVs are through something complicated like legislation? I think it can, but maybe somebody else who knows this better can help. Not to make it seem like it's easy to get climate refugia established, but what do you think, Mary?
Yeah, I can kick it off, and by all means, please, anyone else interrupt me, tell me that I'm wrong. But we're definitely thinking about this a lot right now, and there's kind of three different strategies, kind of three different bins in the consideration here. It's looking at, when we're thinking about, at least within the Forest Service, how we're looking at climate refugia, or how we could look at climate refugia as an ORV. There's really those three options. There is, do we need to bring it out as a specific standalone ORV? Can it be considered under an other, which is an yes, absolutely. And then do we incorporate it into other ORVs, the components of it, and associated with that species that it is providing refugia for, essentially. Where it can get a little tricky with other is you know, other is open, which is really great. And it gives some flexibility for, you know, to decide what is it that is unique to your river to consider. You know, one of the benefits, and even though this can be applicable as well, you know, one of the benefits that we're looking at is when we put it out there is really having some direction of how we consider the ORV. When you look at standalone ORVs, we already have direction that speaks to the considerations when you're evaluating that ORV specifically. And so that's one of those outliers right now is they're just not being guidance around how we consider climate refugia as an ORV, whether standalone or as an other. But it wholeheartedly can already be incorporated into other. We don't have any hard, you know, there's no direction that says you cannot consider climate refugia as an other ORV at this point in time. It's really just that trying to give some guidelines for evaluations to really help standardize how we're evaluating climate refugia nationally, essentially, if that makes sense. But no, you're completely right. There's already, the mechanism is there through other to be identified. I know there's in this gets talked about in that link that Angie provided from last year's roundtable, where there was kind of a large scale conversation over the pros and cons, and not even cons, but the pluses and minuses of climate refugia being a wholeheartedly standalone ORV outside of other. So there's a lot of different viewpoints and intricacies there, but right now, if a river chose to, they absolutely could include climate refugia under other for their considerations in their ORVs right now. So,
because I think it would be, the harder part is how to manage it. How do you manage the climate around your climate? That's, to me, that's way harder. So being able to put it in other, if someone can figure it out, seems good.
right. And yeah, and that kind of goes hand in hand with that, how we are considering and evaluating it as well, which kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier as well, as like the value of a river might be, you know, could be considered a refugia, even though it doesn't currently have a sensitive population or something to that effect. That's where those challenges kind of start coming in.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I also see Fred added a resource to the chat for the 5th National Climate Assessment. And mentioned, yeah, offers slideshows and has on a wide variety of climate change topics around all different regions. And I was listening recently to some podcasts that accompany that, so I put an extra little link there. You might have to go to that page and then click on companion podcast, but lots of great resources on both of those links. And I know we are getting close to the end of our time. So if you have any last questions, now is the time. And I do just want to remind folks that we have our 6th and final webinar in our training series. It's going to be on June 12th at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific. And we're going to be looking at when outstandingly remarkable values change. What does that look like? Are there examples of where this has been done? Maybe they're improving, but maybe they're changing because of some sort of climate related thing, or maybe it's a man-made thing. So we're going to be open to have some good discussion during that. So if you haven't registered, I encourage you to do so. And I just want to say thank you again to Lela and Mary and Dave and everyone else who participated today. Lots of great resources shared. Again, I will be processing this recording and uploading it to YouTube, as well as emailing it out to everyone. I'll also provide a PDF of the slides with all the links, or even all the links listed out in the email. just so that you have access to all these resources and tools. And I just encourage everyone to, continue collaborating with each other, continue having these conversations, because we're all still trying to figure things out, and there's a lot of great ideas being generated all over the country in all different types of situations. So thank you all, and have a few more minutes to stay on for questions, but if there's none, then I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.